Good day, beautiful people. This is Natalie Silva with Life's Treasures and Golden Moments, sharing with you true stories of miracles and inspiration. Welcome back once again to my podcast. Before I begin, I'd like to make a request that if any of you out there have a story of a miracle or a story of an inspiration that you'd like to share, please contact me at angelswhisper11@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. The story I'm sharing with you today is called One Good Turn by Charles Sellier. It's a story about a young man in his early 30s who was very self-centered, and he felt his wants and needs were more important than anyone else's until he is forced by circumstance to reach out, which changes his thinking and his way of life. Unlike old dogs, human beings can indeed be taught new tricks. Most of us do change and grow throughout our lives. The challenge, it seems, is to change and grow with purpose, to do it in such a way that we can help make the world of our town or just our neighborhood a little better place. For most people, that just sort of happens as they come in contact with new people, new situations, and new responsibilities. There are some, however, who seem to need a little push in the right direction. Al and Jackie Miller loved living in the city. They were young, upward, and mobile, as the term is used these days, and black. He was in his early 30s, a successful writer for a small advertising agency, and bent on enjoying the fruits of his labor. She, on the other hand, was in her late 20s, had a supervisory position with a phone company, and believed that one of the reasons to work hard and get a bigger apartment was to make room for a growing family. In this latter regard, Al and Jackie did not see eye to eye. One warm Saturday afternoon, Al and Jackie decided to go apartment hunting. Their discussions about increasing the size of their family always wound up floundering on the shoals of Al's sense of me, my, and mine, so Jackie decided to take another tack. She suggested they look for a bigger apartment in the more upscale neighborhood. Al just jumped at the idea. The fact was that Al Miller had made a maypole out of the first-person personal pronoun, and he spent much of his time just looking for excuses to dance around it. Few of his sentences began with anything other than the letter I. To call Al ambitious, impatient, and frankly self-centered would not be far off the mark. Jackie loved him, but she realized, too, that he was becoming a bore. The Millers had just come out of an apartment house in a neighborhood that wasn't quite up to what Al had decided was his standard, and he was anxious to move uptown. Jackie was scanning the listings in the real estate section of the paper they had brought with them and wanted to look at a few more apartments in the immediate area. The discussion was still going on when Marcia Givens walked up to the crosswalk where Al and Jackie were standing and waiting for the light to change and arguing about which direction to go next. Marcia was a plain woman, probably in her early 30s, and just a little preoccupied. In fact, Marcia Givens seemed a little preoccupied most of the time, a true Earth Mother type. She had never married, but she loved children and spent much of her time working with gifted but disadvantaged youngsters from all over the city. Al didn't know any of this, of course. He just looked up from the paper and saw her start to step off into the street in front of a car that had no intention of stopping. In that instant, Al Miller made the move that would change his life forever. He leapt forward, grabbed Marcia Givens around the waist, and pulled her back out of the path of the oncoming car. The driver belatedly saw the woman and slammed on his brakes, screeching to a stop and barely missing the 2 bags of groceries that Marcia had been carrying, when Al's sudden rescue sent them crashing to the ground. Marcia looked at the car and swallowed hard. Then she turned to look at her benefactor. "Thanks," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "That was close. I owe you." "No, that's okay," Al replied. "Sorry about the bags." The driver of the car glared at the trio standing on the curb, cursed and drove away, as Marcia bent down to try and salvage what she could from her shopping trip. Here, let me give you a hand, Jackie said, stooping to pick up a can of corn and what was left of a bag of potatoes. Oh, thanks, Marcia replied. It's my own fault, really. I told them not to use double bags. Why kill another tree, right? Al looked on with a growing frustration as the two women gathered up what they could in their arms. Jackie saw that there was no way they were going to be able to carry all of these items they could retrieve, so she just started handing things to Al. He glared at her as each new item dropped in his arms, but he said nothing. Why don't we just help you carry these things? Jackie volunteered. You'll never make it by yourself. Thanks again, Marcia said. My apartment's just across the street. The two women started across the street as soon as the light changed. Al rolled his eyes toward the heavens, muttering something about not having time for this kind of Boy Scout junk, but he dutifully followed his wife. You folks looking for an apartment? Marcia asked. Yes, as a matter of fact, we are, Jackie said, was obviously only surprised. How did you know? Not too many people stand around on the street corner discussing real estate ads unless they're looking for an apartment. Jackie laughed. No sense in being subtle about it, is it? They turned down the walkway into Marcia's apartment building. Al reluctantly followed with his armload of cans and fresh vegetables. This is a great neighborhood, Marcia said. I hope you'll find a place. You'll really like it here. Just as they reached the main entrance of the building, the door opened and the apartment manager came out. She recognized Marcia immediately and held the door open for them. As they made their way inside, Marcia noticed the manager was holding an apartment for rent sign in her hand. Oh, Joan, she said brightly, if something opens up in the building, these people are looking for an apartment. Al grimaced, but Marcia quickly turned to Jackie and added, if something has opened up in this building, you really should check it out. It was quite a scene. Jackie was inside, the real estate listings jammed in her pocket, her hands full of potatoes, a box of cornflakes under one arm, and a roll of paper towels under the other. Joan, the apartment manager, was outside, holding the door open with one hand and clutching the brand-new for rent sign with the other. Al was facing the apartment manager with his arms full of cans and boxes, wondering if maybe he wouldn't have been better off just to let Marcia step in front of the car. And Marcia? Marcia was standing half in, half out of the door, trying her best to match everyone up. There was a long, awkward silence, and finally Joan spoke up. My name is Joan, she said, the apartment manager. We have a 2-bedroom that just became vacant, if you would like to take a look. Yes, Jackie said, just barely ahead of Al's, no, I don't think so. Another awkward silence during which Al had time to catch the withering look that Jackie fired in his direction. Well, he said, as long as we have to go inside anyway, we might as well take a look. He paused, but nobody moved. We are going inside, or are we not? They all laughed, everyone but Al, and went on into the foyer. Up one flight was Marcia's apartment. Once the groceries were stacked on the table, everyone felt a little more comfortable, especially the girls. By the time Al had his armload to the pile of the 3 women, they were chatting along like long-lost friends. Some might think only a slight coincidence that an apartment became available in this particular building that very moment. Al and Jackie came along. Nothing could be further from the truth. This pleasant Saturday would hereafter mark a special day in Al Miller's life. He was unaware of it at the time, but this was a day, one of the miracles that would change his life. By the end of the month, Jackie and Al Miller had not only moved into the apartment, they were on the same floor as their new friend Marcia. After all was said and done, Al had to admit that it was a very pleasant, nice apartment. The rent was reasonable, and the commute downtown convenient, and the neighborhood as pleasant as Marcia had told them it would be. Jackie was thrilled, and even though they didn't often discuss it, Al knew that his wife was mentally redecorating that 2nd bedroom as a nursery. That, however, was not the biggest of his problems. His biggest problem was Marcia Givens, now friend, neighbor, and everlasting responsibility. Somehow, Marcia, single, a school librarian, and a little bit eccentric, always seemed to be getting herself into trouble. That might not have been so bad, except that she always seemed to get in trouble at the very instant Al Miller walked by. For example, there was this morning last week when Al came walking into the parking lot to find Marcia, a cardboard box full of canned food in her arms, standing there staring at a flat tire on her old Valiant. Oh, no, not this time, he thought. He walked straight to his own car, opened the door, tossed his briefcase inside, but it was too late. He had seen the pleading look in her eyes. Muttering under his breath, Al tossed his jacket in on top of his briefcase and rolled up his sleeves as he walked over to where Marcia was standing. "We're having a canned goods drive sale at school for the victims of the hurricane," she said apologetically. "This is the last day." "Uh-huh," Al said. "You got a jack for this heap?" "Yeah, it's in there somewhere." Al took the box from her and set it on the ground while she fumbled in her purse for her keys. 20 minutes later, she was on her way, and Al was heading back to his apartment to wash up and change his shirt. The part that irritated Al as much as anything was the fact that Marcia was such a do-gooder. She recycled everything, volunteered for community service, and even thought her own life seemed to be on the very edge of coming unglued. She always had time to help others. This was not the sort of person Al Miller could understand. "Thanks. That's another one I owe you." Al mimicked her gratitude as he stomped up the stairs. "I should be running a tab on this walking disaster," he muttered to himself. "I'd own this whole building by now." He was still mumbling under his breath when he came back down and climbed into under the steering wheel of his own car. He looked at his watch, suppressed a swear word, and headed downtown a half hour late. "One of these days," he vowed, "I'm just going to say no." Funny part of it was that by the time he got to his office, he was feeling pretty good. He couldn't quite put his finger on the reason why, but he felt good. Al was even kind of looking forward to explaining to his boss that he was late because he'd taken time to help a neighbor change a tire. But that was just one example. At every turn with Marcia, it was something new. Al could hardly get through a day, let alone a week, without there being some bit of help she appeared to need. And always it seemed as if Al was the only one there to help. Certainly Marcia didn't plan these things. Still, Al had trouble believing it was all spontaneous. Even more confusing was the fact that Marcia never asked for his help. She was just there in some kind of trouble, and always Al was presented with the same dilemma: ignore the situation, which he was indeed inclined to do, or give her a hand, which is what he always did. At first he was annoyed, even irritated. But what if he felt he was forced with his generosity? Surely she must see that he didn't enjoy picking her marbles up every day. But as time passed, something changed, and although he would never admit it, that something was Al himself. One Saturday morning, just as Al was trying the last knot in his jogging shoes, ready to head out the door, Jackie came rushing in. "Oh, I'm glad I caught you," she said breathlessly. "Marcia's apartment door won't open. She's with her group from the community center, and one of them needs to, make a pit stop." "Why am I not surprised?" Al said, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. He shrugged his shoulders as if he were helpless again this continuing tide of good deeds, and walked out the door. Marcia, as I mentioned earlier, was not married. She regarded the group of gifted children she worked with as her kids, and spent as much time with them as possible. She had discovered them, as she liked to tell people, through a reading program she had set up in the inner city community center. These kids were not merely bright, they were gifted, and all of them came from broken or otherwise disadvantaged homes. Marcia took these special children under her wing. She provided their curious and amazing receptive minds with stimulation and inspiration of museums, concerts, and plays. In many ways, she was their best chance, perhaps their only chance, to reach their great potential. Al made his way through the small throng of eager youngsters and tried the doorknob. It resisted as if it were locked, even though the key was in the slot. Al tried to turn it with a key, with the same result. Out of the corner of his eye, Al noticed one young girl, all but in pain, trying desperately to hold back one of nature's imperatives. "This might take a minute," he whispered to her. "Why don't you go over there to my apartment?" The girl sighed audibly and turned around and dashed for his door. Al smiled and went back to the task at hand. It took a bit of doing. He had to move the key slowly in and out of the lock, turning the knob back and forth as he did so. But finally there was a click, and the mechanism turned freely. "I owe you one again," Marcia said, as the kids pushed by him into the apartment. "Yeah, sure, I know." He turned and started down the stairs. As he reached the bottom step, he tossed back, "One of these days, I'm going to collect." Al had no way of knowing how true that was. Several days later, Millers were down in the laundry room, while waiting for the machines to finish their work. They were revisiting the same old argument they had 100 times before. "Sometimes I don't think you want to have kids at all," Jackie complained. "Hey," Al responded idly, "worse things could happen." "Maybe," Jackie replied, obviously stunned by his reply, "but I can't think of a worse thing than not to happen." They were interrupted as Joan came down the stairs and headed for one of the dryers. "Hi there," she said pleasantly. "Everything working okay out in the apartment?" "Yes," Jackie said, throwing Al an angry glance. "Everything in the apartment is just fine." Al started to say something, but thought better of it. He picked up the laundry basket and placed it firmly next to the one of the machines. But when he opened the lid, he found it full of somebody else's clothes. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, turning to Joan. "Are these yours?" "No," the apartment manager's shoulders drooped. "They've been there a couple of days. Probably belong to Marcia." She walked over and looked into the machine, adding, "She gets so busy sometimes. She just forgets the clothes are down here." Joan walked back to her own machine and started shoving coins in the slot as if she were angry. "Marcia's a real nice person," she said on the verge of tears. "It's really too bad." The tone of her voice and her strange attitude made Jackie suddenly apprehensive. "Too bad?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "Oh, it's just that she does so much for everybody else. It just makes me mad that she has the one that—" Her voice trailed off. "That she's the one that what?" Jackie prompted. Joan started the machine and picked up her empty basket. "I thought she might have told you. You seem like such good friends." "Told us?" Al chimed in, suddenly interested. "Told us what?" "Cancer. Marcia has pancreatic cancer. It's terminal, and it's a real shame." Joan walked back up the stairs, leaving Al and Jackie staring at each other in a numb silence. Later that night in the apartment, their mood was still one of somber incredibility. They had gotten so used to seeing Marcia bustling in and out of the apartment, carrying boxes and bags or herding them for some of her kids. The thought that someday soon she might not be there just didn't want to take hold. "That news about Marcia," Jackie said as she slipped under the covers, "I just can't get it out of my mind." "Yeah, me too." Al sat down on the edge of the bed. "I keep thinking about how at first you didn't want to help her." Jackie reached over and touched his arm. "But every time you turned around, there she was with another problem." Al looked down at his hands and shook his head. "And every time I got sucked in to fixing it." "You know what?" Jackie continued. "For all your moaning and groaning and complaining, you liked it." Al flipped out the light and slipped under the covers beside his wife. "No way," he said firmly. "It's true," Jackie insisted. "Just like the time you ended up driving all those kids from the community center to the zoo when the car broke down. You came home complaining, but you kept talking about the trip and the kids all through summer." "Come on, Al," I said, "was the kids had a good time." "Right, and it took you 2 hours to tell me that." Jackie turned on her side. She just could make out his face in the darkened room. "You know, every time you came back from doing something for her, you came back a little different, a little happier." She slipped an arm across his shoulders and waited for a response. There was a long pause. Finally Al said, You're dreaming. Get some sleep. Jackie snuggled up closer to him. I love you, she whispered. I always have. But I want you to know that since we moved in here, I'm finding more and more things about you that I love so much. Things continued on around the apartment house pretty much the same way they always had over the next several months. Marcia didn't say anything to the Millers about her problem, and they didn't think it appropriate to ask. Both Al and Jackie were unaware, however, that they were seeing less and less of Marcia. In fact, when it came time for them to leave for a 2-week trip to Chicago to visit Jackie's parents, they hadn't seen her for several days. They were still unloading bags from the trunk of the car on their return from the trip when they noticed Joan standing in the entryway to the parking area with a couple that had never seen before. They were close enough to overhear her conversation. I can't get the painters until next week, she told them, but it should be available by the 1st of the month. The apartment manager turned and held the door open for the pair as they made their way back inside. Jackie hurried over in time to catch Joan before the door closed behind her. Joan, she said, fearing the worst, has somebody moved out? The look on Joan's face told her fears had been realized. Marcia, she said, fighting back the tears. Marcia died a few days after you left. Al had come up to join the two women, but he quickly turned away when he felt the tears coming to his eyes. In the silence that followed, 100 questions thundered through his mind. Why her? Why now? Why so suddenly? What about the kids? It was the last question that really tugged at him. In his most quiet moments, Al realized the news of Marcia's death had affected him far more than he could ever anticipated. And even though he had no way of knowing it at the time, Al Miller's business on this earth with Marcia Givens was far from over. It was several nights later, the pillow talk in the Miller apartment turned once again to the subject of Marcia Givens. I miss her, Jackie sighed. Al turned on his side, his face away from her. Believe it or not, he said, so do I. There was a long silence, and suddenly Al turned over on his back. Those kids from the community center, he said. I wonder what's going to happen to them. I don't know, Jackie replied sleepily. Maybe somebody will come along. She drifted off to sleep, but Al was having difficulty putting his thoughts about those kids to rest. At 3 a.m., he looked at the clock and moaned and tried once again to get his mind and body to accept the idea of sleep. Perhaps he had finally drifted off, or maybe he had just succumbed to fatigue and was stranded somewhere between sleep and waking. Wherever he was abruptly aware of a shadow sweeping past the bedroom door into the hallway. Al sat up on the edge of the bed and rubbed his eyes. It was more something he felt than something he saw, and he stood up to go investigate. He realized that whatever was going on was not meant to frighten him. At the bedroom door, he stopped and looked down to the end of the hall. There was nothing there. This is nuts, he thought to himself. I've got to get some sleep. There's no time to sleep. Al spun around and looked at the bed. Jackie was still dead to the world, but he knew he had heard a voice, and that voice had said, "There's no time to sleep." He looked back into the hall, and there, standing in the half-light afforded by the undraped kitchen window, he saw Marcia Givens. He instantly realized that it had been her voice he had heard. "Marcia," he stammered, how, you've got to come, Al, right now, come right now." Al didn't know what was happening, but he recognized the urgency in her voice and followed after her. When he reached the apartment door, Marcia turned one more time to make sure he was following, then opened the door and hurried out into the main hallway. "I've got to be dreaming this," Al muttered to himself. But he followed her nevertheless. As Al stepped into the hallway, he caught one last glimpse of Marcia as she disappeared in a cloud of thick smoke. His eyes stunned, and he coughed convulsively. This was no dream. The building was on fire. The image of Masha faded from his mind, and he rushed back into his own bedroom and shook Jackie awake. What? She stammered angrily at first at his rough treatment. Jackie, get up, now. We've got to get out of here. The acrid smell of smoke hit her nostrils, and she jumped up immediately when they got back to the hall. Al pointed Jackie toward the stairway and gave her a gentle push. Hurry, he said. Jackie realized Al was hanging back and stopped. Come on, she cried. No, Al said. For some reason, the alarm isn't working. You've got to go to the first floor and wake up Joan. Call the fire department. I've got to get everybody out of here. Al turned and dashed down the hallway into the smoke. Jackie could hear him pounding on doors and shouting as she made her way down to Joan's apartment. A few months earlier, she would have been stunned at the idea of Al Miller's risking his life to save others, but on this night it seemed to her precisely the thing her husband would do. By the time the firemen arrived, Al had been successful in waking up all the other tenants, and he got them out of the building. He was standing next to Jackie, watching the firemen wheel the hoses and bring the fire under control, when Joan came up to him. I want to thank you, she said. Helping everybody get out like that probably saved a lot of lives tonight. Al continued to stare at the building. The experience that had woken him up was now coming back to his mind, and the implications of it were staggering. He could almost hear Masha's voice again. That's another one I owe you, she would have said. Al smiled. He knew he had just collected the full debt. I still don't understand, Joan continued. What made you get up and go out into the hall? How did you know there was a fire? It's a little hard to explain, Al said quietly, bringing Jackie into a closer embrace. Right now, I'd just like to make sure everybody from the building is all right. Jackie put both arms around her husband and held him tightly. The tears that stained her face were not caused by the smoke from the fire. Things got back to normal very quickly around this apartment building, in spite of all the smoke. Al and Jackie's early warning had alerted the fire department in time to prevent the fire itself from doing a great deal of damage. Getting back to normal also meant the apartment manager began to see the kids from the community center going in and out on a regular basis once again. That hadn't happened since Masha had died. It didn't take her long to discover that it was Al Miller who was responsible. When she asked him about it one day, he just shrugged and told her he was sure Masha would have wanted someone to keep the lights turned on for those kids, and he always had a little spare time. Not many months after that, Joan noticed something about the Millers. Al had traded his car in on a minivan so he could get more kids to more places more often. Then one afternoon, as the van started to pull out of the driveway, the apartment manager saw Jackie rush out, waving and shouting. The group had started to leave without the lunches she had so carefully prepared for them. That in of itself wasn't too surprising. But when she turned to walk back into the building, Joan noticed that Mrs. Miller was decidedly pregnant. Finally, some wondrous power had brought things full circle. One formerly selfish man had been literally forced by circumstance to reach out and help a woman in need, and he had discovered that deep down he felt good. Masha Gibbons, who could no longer provide the love and attention her deserving special children needed, must have thought Al Miller was a perfect candidate to take over the job, even if it took a miracle. We suspect she also knew that he sorely needed a lesson in giving and loving. One final note. In less than a year, little Masha Miller was born. I hope you enjoyed our story today, and it will inspire you to think about the gifts that you have that are a part of you, and how you can use those gifts to help make our world a better place for all, wherever you may be. This is Natalie Silver. Thanks for listening. Until next time, have a blessed day. Take care now.